Good morning. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word. I'm Barry Bryson. We're continuing our study, excuse me, of Matthew's parables or Jesus' parables in Matthew's Gospel. And we're going to spend a good deal of time in Matthew chapter 13. As I said, 5 sermons or addresses in Matthew's Gospel, which is significant. There are 5 books of Moses. Matthew is clearly a Jewish gospel. We begin with the Sermon on the Mount. Instead of commands, we have beatitudes. Okay, Sermon on the Mount. Jesus, and the setting is important. Jesus sitting in Moses' seat, sitting down to teach on top of a mountain. Um, and then we have the missionary sermon in address in John 10 when he sends them out and he tells them how they're supposed to act on the road and they should have confidence, and that's Matthew 10. And then the sermon of parables, which is here in Matthew 13. Matthew 10 contains no parables. Matthew 5 through 7, the Sermon on the Mount, ends with, the master parable, the master key that teaches us how to read a parable. And then we have the parables we talked about last time in chapter 9, unshrunk cloth, the wineskin, the bridegroom. And then we come to Matthew 13, where Jesus' use of parables as a teaching tool is discussed, and we have so many examples together. And so let's talk about Matthew chapter 13 for just a moment. The next time we'll talk about the first parable, the parable of the sower. So there are 6 parables given in Matthew 13. There are two long ones, and then, or excuse me, eight parables. There are 2 long ones and 6 short ones. And the 2 long ones, that are sort of short stories, are the parable of the sower. It's not really a short story, it's just an extended image, much like the wise and foolish builders. And then there's the parable of the tares, which is very much like a short story. And these 2 long ones both have explanations that Jesus then gives to his disciples after he tells them to the crowd. And then we have the 6 shorter, and they're all paired up. These 8 make 4 pairs. The sower and the tares, the 2 long ones, really emphasize the fact that the gospel has a different effect on people. There are different ways people respond, and that people are going to then be at some point separated. That there is a different outcome that people are going to experience as they encounter the gospel because they respond to it differently. And that's communicated in both the parables of the wheat, the sower, and the parable of the wheat and tares. And then we have 2 parables that are matched together that are about the growth of the kingdom, that facet out different kinds of growth. The parable of the mustard seed and the parable of the leaven in the lump of dough. And then we have 2 parables, again, married together, that are about the value, the preciousness of the kingdom, and that's the treasure in the field and the pearl of great price. And then we have the last 2. And sometimes that last parable isn't called a parable at all, but it is. It's very much a parable. It's called a parable, and even though it's very short. And the first of the parables of this last couple is the parable of the dragnet. And then we have the parable of the scribe. And in both of those, there's judgment and discernment emphasized, the great sorting. In fact, sorting out really plays a role in all of these. In every one of these parables, there's the sense of sorting and identifying what's good and what's not good is in every one of these parables. So discernment might be the theme of the whole sermon. Also, we get the explanation of why Jesus taught in parables. We talked about that earlier when we introduced the whole notion of parables and why Jesus used parables. And so there are 2 different explanations, both of them using Old Testament quotes from Isaiah and from the Psalms. And the first quote, you know, they don't understand and then seeing they may not see, hearing they may not understand. It makes it sound like Jesus is trying to use parables to obscure his teaching. That's not what he's saying at all, because in the second explanation later on that quotes the Psalms, um, he says the exact opposite, that he wants them to understand what he is saying. I will open my mouth in parables. I will utter the things hidden since the foundation of the world. That's a quote from Psalm 78. So it really is about people understanding, but they have to think. You have to think and you have to process. You have to think something through. Parable forces you to think something through. As I said in our first session, this is not a Chilton manual. It doesn't just say, take this tool and perform this action. The parables are told to us as stories so that we'll get it, so that we understand. That means we've got to think it through. But it also means we respond. Jesus says in Matthew 13, if you have an ear to hear, then hear. Having an ear to hear means to comprehend. But as we said in Hebrew, to hear also means to obey. That's the phrase that means to obey. Hear the voice. That's the phrase that's translated obey. And so this is also not just about comprehension, but about obedience. We'll talk about parable of the sower next time. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word.